Hi guys, it's Mrs. Mattingly here, and I am reading Addison Cooke and the Tomb of the Khan, chapter 42, Malazar, and it starts on page 418. Addison stood froze on the spot, unable to blink, unable to speak. Somewhere he could hear Molly screaming. Eddie and Raj grabbed him by the shoulders, urging him to move. He stumbled over tuffets of wild grass as though in a dream, barely aware of voices of the movement of his own feet. Boris snatched the golden whip off the ground. Madame Fang shouted. The triads opened fire. The Vori fired right back, pinning them down. Boris trotted the whip back to the helicopter and handed it to Malazar. He pivoted and plodded back towards Addison, hollering over the roar of the chopper. Now it's your turn. All Cookes must die. Addison watched numbly as the big Russian swatted Eddie and Raj aside. Boris grabbed a handful of Addison's shirt to stand him up straight. Addison stared expressionless at the enormous fist swinging towards his gut. The punch belted Addison back to his senses. His stomach seized up and he doubled over, unable to draw breath. He dropped to his knees, pain focusing in his mind. He became aware of the battlefield. Vori were closing in on Molly. Nobody and I don't know. Other Vori were taking on the triads. There were still no Darkhad to be seen. Boris wound up for a knockout punch to Addison's temple. Addison, unable to move or breathe, realized the blow might kill him. It was strange how the thought wafted into his mind, a simple objective fact. He was about to die. Addison was trying to think of something clever to say or do when he was greeted by the unusual sight of Tony Chin flying horizontally through the air. Tony's foot connected with Boris in a devastating kick. Addison's mind reeled, stunned to find himself still alive and breathing. It was a pleasant surprise. He stared, dazed, as Tony wrestled the bigger man to the ground. Tony did not stand much of a chance against the giant Russian. It seemed a pity. Addison rather liked Tony. Tony rolled onto his back, frantically blocking Boris's punches with his elbows. Addison, your butterfly knife! Addison's stomach was slowly recovering from Boris's punch. He found himself able to take small sips of breath. Small sips were better than nothing. He drew his butterfly knife from his pocket and slashed at Boris. The big Vor rolled off of Tony and backed off a pace. Tony grinned at Addison. Remember, knife point down. Addison nodded, flipping the knife in his hand with practiced ease. Boris wielded, seeking an easier target, and turned on Molly. His job was to eliminate Cookes, and it didn't matter which. Come here, little girl. He swung an arm for her neck, hoping to clothesline her off her feet. Molly's face was streaked with tears. She managed to duck the blow. Boris overreached, his body overbalanced. Molly saw her opening. She centered her weight and scooped her foot into the air, soaring a punching roundhouse kick. She planted her foot right in Boris's kidney. Her balance, her breathing, her timing, she knew it was perfect. The big Vor stumbled backward a step, clutching his side, blinking his eyes in surprise. Molly blew the strand of hair from her face. I'm not a little girl. Before Boris could respond, Tony Chin attacked him again. Addison grabbed Molly by the arm. They slipped past Boris and Tony and sprinted across the field. Addison's mind was still in dull, ringing shock from the sight of his aunt and uncle falling into oblivion. He forced his feet to keep moving. He had a vague plan of reaching the river for safety. Eddie and Raj galloped alongside him. Halfway to the river, Addison glanced over his shoulders to see Tony flat on the ground and Boris pounding toward them. Addison's team put on steam, but Boris's legs were longer, catching up quickly. The group's 100-yard lead became 90, and then 80. Addison racked his brain for options. "Molly, your sling!" Molly plucked the weapon from her survival pack and scooped up a stone on the run. She spun the sling over her head, wheeled on Boris, and loosed the shot. The rock sailed 3 feet over his head. He was now only 50 yards away. She snatched up a second rock on the fly and sent it sailing at Boris. It grazed his kneecap, but he kept right on coming. It was like flinging a pebble at a freight train. Addison could see they weren't going to make it to the river. Boris was too fast. Addison had one last card to play. He drew his flare gun from his blazer, spun, and fired it at Boris. He missed, sending a bolt of red fireworks sizzling across the plateau to explode over the valley. The daylight turned from yellow to red. Addison had no more rounds for the flare gun. He could see no more stones for Molly among the wildflowers. Raj stepped forward. "I've got this." He pulled a metal can from his pack and held it out in front of his body like a talisman. He stood his ground, staring down Boris. Boris saw they were no longer fleeing. He slowed to a stop and stared at Raj's can, amused. "What is that? A soda?" Raj solemnly shook his head. "No. Bear spray." Boris only had time to raise one eyebrow. Raj pulled the tab. A jet of pepper spray blasted Boris in the snout. He wailed like he'd bear-hugged a beehive. Addison's team turned and bolted. Boris, enraged, pulled out his gun for the first time. He jacked the slide and aimed through red and swollen eyes. His first 2 bullets fired wide. Addison ran so fast he thought his chest would burst. He wondered if any had ever died of a heart attack while trying to run from being shot by a gun. "He's gonna kill us!" Eddie shouted. "Babatunde Okonjo," Raj called. "What about Babatunde Okonjo?" Molly hollered. Raj sprinted faster and pointed ahead. "Run for the river! It only takes 3 feet of water to stop a bullet." "Are you sure?" "All bullets up to .50 caliber disintegrate in just under 3 feet of water." A third bullet whistled overhead. Addison did not have the mental energy to question Raj. Besides, he didn't have a better plan to offer. He was glad they had diverted the river. It was closer now. The shock wave of a 4th bullet sizzled past his ear. Molly's foot caught on a rock and sent her sprawling. Raj picked her up by the elbow. The group reached the riverbank. "Dive!" shouted Raj. They leaped head first into the river and swam, pulling hard, willing themselves deeper and deeper under the current. Addison watched a bullet strike the surface of the water, flattening on impact. The slug slowed, tracing an arc through the water until it floated, harmlessly, past Addison's head. He reached out and cupped the bullet in his hand. It was warm to the touch. More slugs carved paths through the water, streaking to a stop before they reached Addison's team in the depths. Together they swam to the far side of the river, finally breaching the surface when their lungs were burning. Molly clapped Raj hard on the back. "Raj, you saved me. You saved all of us." Raj blushed red and was unable to speak. "Boris still has more bullets," shouted Eddie, pointing across the river. Boris's eyes were still streaming tears from the bear spray. He blinked hard and took careful aim at Addison. Addison saw the moment Boris's gun barreled drew level with his right eye. That was when an arrow struck Boris in the thigh. He collapsed to one knee, firing his gun uselessly into the dirt. The dark had climbed over the crest of the Eagle Cliff, losing arrows and shouting their battle cries. Both triads and Vorey were driven before them. Addison watched the triads form a protective circle around Madame Fang. Dark-Had warriors charged the gang members, attacking with arrows, spears, and hand-to-hand fighting. Hu was tackled to the ground and lost in the melee. Madame Fang called out to Tony Chin, begging for help, but could not remember his name. "You there! Do something! Help me!" Addison saw Tony, battered and bruised, turn his back on Madame Fang. Tony waved goodbye to Addison and strolled away across the meadow, heading for a stand of trees. The Dark-Had swept past him. He disappeared into the forest. The Dark-Had surrounded the Russians, who put up a stiff fight. Nobody turned to Addison. "We have to join the Dark-Had. They need us." Addison nodded. "I'm sorry about the golden whip." "I don't know," gripped Addison's hands in hers. "I'm sorry the Dark-Had were late." Addison shook his head. He was not ready to think about it. Whatever happens, the Dark-Had must divert this river back. There is still a chance the Russians will never find the entrance to the hidden valley. Nobody urged his sister toward the battlefield. "Come on, they need us." "I don't know," turned back one more time and hugged Addison fiercely. She whispered in his ear, "I'm sorry about your aunt and uncle." She turned and ran after her brother. Addison watched the Russians retreat to their military helicopter, the Dark-Had charging after them. To his surprise, the helicopter shut its doors to the Vorey and lifted off. He caught a glimpse of Malazar in the passenger seat, clutching the golden whip and abandoning his men. Boris stood under the hurricane winds of the rotor blades and bellowed in rage. The Dark-Had fired arrows up the fleeting chopper, the points bouncing harmlessly off the metal frame. The helicopter sped north, shrinking into the distance. Addison wondered if his team could escape. He knew that soon the Dark-Had would turn their fury on him. Molly cried out, stabbing her finger at the sky. A plane appeared along the ridge of the cliff. It flew dangerously low over the rim of the gorge and stuck a short landing on the field of wildflowers. "Dax!" Raj shouted. Addison's group splashed into the river and swam across. Sopping wet, they hurled over the hillocks of grass until they drew even with the plane. Dax kicked open the door with his foot. He was already steering the plane due south for an exit. Mr. Jacobson barked when he saw the group. He tried to bounce off the plane to greet everyone, but Dax held him by the collar. Raj leapt around, calling over the roar of the engines. "I knew you'd come back for us." "I got a call at the Muddy Duck. Wouldn't have found you if you hadn't shot that flare." "What airplane is this?" "It's the Cessna Skyhawk," Dax said proudly. Raj gave a thumbs up. "She's beautiful." Addison's team piled on board. Dax was already gunning the engine by the time Raj yanked the door shut and sealed it. Dark-Had warriors thundered towards the tiny plane, firing their weapons. Dax aimed for the lip of the field. Just beyond it lay a 1,000-foot drop. 100 yards of runway, he muttered. He kissed his finger and tapped a brand new plastic frog on his dashboard. Addison's team touched it for good luck. Dax opened the engines. The kick of speed flattened Addison's group against the back of their seats. The edge of the world rushed up to meet them. The little plane plummeted right over the side of the cliff before catching wind. The engines revved higher and the plane soared skyward. Addison looked back through his window at the black darkhead screaming across the field, swords high over their heads, descending on the remaining Russians. He never saw what became of Boris. He didn't need to. Dax packed on elevation, drawing the plane far out of the reach of the darkhead arrows. Molly clutched Dax's arm. Shh, almost done. We have to go back for Aunt Delia and Uncle Nigel. Maybe they survived the fall. Maybe they're down there. Dax surveyed the 1,000-foot gorge. He grimaced and shook his head. I can't get a plane in there. It's too dangerous, and the Darkhead will kill you if they find you. Molly turned to Addison. Nobody and I don't know. They trusted us. We have to retrieve the golden whip. We will, Molly. How? Addison could only shake his head. The mountains faded away into the distance. They flew for a long time in silence. Raj, in the front seat, eventually explained to Dax everything that had happened. Addison stared numbly out the window, watching the earth roll away below. He did not speak for hundreds of miles. They passed over the soot-stained skies of Ulaanbaatar and roared high above the blank canvas of the Gobi. Addison took off his uncle's medallion. He could not bear to wear it. He felt as if he did not deserve the honor. He shoved the chain into his blazer pocket. Sunlight died in the west. Streaks of gold and orange light glimmered across the steppe. The steppe. At last, Addison turned to Molly. That was him, he said simply. The man in the helicopter. That was Malazar. And that's the end.